My name is Hallie, and I've knitted as a hobby for about 3 years now. Since I'm also a fan of The Hobbit, it probably shouldn't be very surprising that one of my favorite characters is Ori the Dwarf. The actor who plays him, Adam Brown, has gone on record as saying he loves to knit cardigans and mittens and things like that, and I think that's absolutely adorable. So I've put some thought into what kinds of fibers Ori would and wouldn't have access to, since presumably he's grown up in the Blue Mountains. So he is not a member of the royal family, and he seems to be a member of the merchant class. So he probably would not have access to a whole lot of luxury fibers, silk, for example. There are a couple of exceptions given the geography of where he's grown up, but I will go into those later. He would most likely be knitting with things like wool, mohair, which comes from goats, and other animal fibers, possibly plant fibers too. Now, for outerwear, he would most often and most likely be knitting with something like this. This is Icelandic lopi. It's about as close to raw wool as you can get in a commercial yarn today. It's very lightly spun, and as a lot of reviewers of the yarn had noted, it does look and smell like it came right off the sheep. It's kind of rough against the skin, especially if you haven't soaked it yet, and that is because it has the outer guard hairs of the sheep's wool mixed into it. It would be used to make coats, very likely, and heavy sweaters, and anything that requires a lot of layering underneath to keep from scratching the skin. And in the movie, the dwarves do wear a lot of layers, so that seems to have some basis. For other pieces of outerwear that need to be a little softer for against the skin, uh, Ori would probably knit with something like this. This is Araucanian nature wool, and specifically this is a cowl. It's worn like so. It eliminates the need for a scarf and a hat and is kind of medieval looking. I wore it almost every day last winter during the polar vortex, and this thing seriously saved my ears from being frozen off at least once, probably more than that. It also gives you terrible, terrible hat hair. Sorry about that. So for more everyday kinds of yarn, Ori would use something that's a little softer, like this. This is a Galway worsted. It is what's known in the knitting community as a workhorse, meaning it can be used for just about anything. It's a nice medium weight wool, and it can be used for scarves, hats, sweaters. This is eventually going to be a cardigan. Um, Even baby blankets if you don't mind spot cleaning. That's probably the kind of fiber and the kind of yarn weight that he would use for most of his everyday knits, like the mittens he was wearing in the movies. Now, considering other everyday things, he would probably wear socks that look a bit like this. Now, in modern day yarn, the tweed is usually made out of acrylic, but on Middle Earth, the tweed bits would probably be made out of bits of wool that couldn't be spun properly. They would make yarn very warm and very effective for making socks. This is an example of a luxury fiber that Ori would have access to. This is alpaca, and provided the climate of the Blue Mountains allows it, they would probably live there, and as such, the dwarves would kind of get the fiber at cost. The same thing happens now with cashmere, which is something else that Ori would be able to knit with, since that fiber comes from goats who live in the mountains. If you get cashmere yarn from China, it's often very cheap, since that is where cashmere goats often come from. So I don't have any cashmere on me right now, but um, sorry, technical difficulties. This is a yarn that Ori would definitely be able to knit with, and which I think is hilarious. This is 60% wool and 40% possum. It's from a New Zealand company called Zealana, and the way I imagine it would happen is Ori comes home rip-roaring drunk, drops some roadkill on the kitchen table, and goes, "All right, happy Durin's Day. Here's some supper," before passing out completely. And Ori, being a very resourceful sort of dwarf, as evidenced by his slingshot, would shave the thing and incorporate it into its yarn. I mean, they seem like a household where they reuse their cooking oil. Really waste not, want not. The last thing I'm going to get into is dwarvish color work. A lot of people who design patterns that are based off The Hobbit on knitting communities online have hypothesized that dwarves really use a lot of elaborate geometric patterns, which is something that you see a lot of in the costumes of the Hobbit movies. So for color work, you want to use a thin yarn that is currently tangled up in everything. This is Palette by Knit Picks. It is a fingering weight, which is lightweight. And while it is wool and not processed all that much like superwash wool, it would be relatively soft against the skin. You can put it right up against your face. So it's lightweight and it tends to felt into itself a little with wear. So you would make color work with this that would not fall apart. It wears like iron. I used it to make some mittens with octopuses on them. I really like octopuses. This is what I used my Alafos Lopi for. I'm not finished with it yet, but it is eventually going to have a huge honkin' octopus on it. I think Thorin would wear something like this, only at home. He has to maintain his kingly facade. But his nephews would probably get it for him and, cry at him until he wore it on his birthday. He seems like he's like someone who's a little soft-hearted. So, that's the end of What Won't Ori Knit? Hope you enjoyed.